So what I want to do then is, as Nikolai introduced me, to just speak with you. And I actually, what I'm giving you is a slightly expanded version of a paper that I gave in Austin, Texas a few weeks ago at the Society for American Archaeology meeting. So you're getting the benefit of that. And you can see that it's not solely authored by me, but by my co-principal investigator, Ivan Batun Alpuche, who teaches at Universidad del Oriente in Yucatan and Valladolid, and then Sarah Rowe, my program director for the Inherit program, and Maya Dedrick, one of our graduate students. With some of the readings, if you had a chance to look at them, the current anthropology article and a few others, that you know that one thing that concerns me now is the very limited engagement that Maya archaeologists have with Maya peoples. And their limited participation in archaeology, in Maya archaeology, in anything but a capacity of wielding a machete and excavating down in the tunnels and keeping our stratigraphic changes correct and things like that. So what we're really trying to do with the Inherit program, and I brought some little cards I'll hand out to all of you, is to get a conversation going, get a dialogue going about the past, and doing this sometimes in the schools, sometimes over radio, sometimes through marionettes or puppets, just all sorts of different out-of-the-box ways of jump-starting a conversation about the past that to make Maya archaeology a more inclusive endeavor. And in the process of doing this, we've realized that even though Maya archaeologists, those of us who call ourselves that, are mostly fascinated with the classic period, that the classic period, this time 600 to 830 or a little bit later, is a very distant time. So I was thinking about this in European times and realizing that this is the same time as the time of Charlemagne here in Germany. So we are then asking people to relate to something that is very, very, very distant ancestry. So we will then, so then we got the idea, well, let's start with the colonial period. Let's go to something a little bit more recent. The colonial period, after all, is still 500 years ago. And so what you're looking at here is the ruins of a colonial mission church at a place called Tahcabo in Yucatan. And I think this period of time is a fascinating period of time because it is so turbulent, it's so dramatic, it's very violent, there's just so much going on, so much is being lost by certain people, gained by other people. And so we thought, okay, we have all these big mission churches, but what we don't know very much about are who has ever excavated an early colonial Maya house. Okay, we have all these tribute records that suggest that women were being asked to weave unbelievable numbers of mantas, and that the apiarios were producing beeswax for the candles for the Catholic churches and so on and so forth. But we have very little actual concrete information that might corroborate this from archaeological contexts. And so that's really what we're doing at Tahcabo, is we're trying to find early colonial Maya houses. So we spent some time looking at a number of different places, and then we kind of liked Tahcabo. And one of the reasons, of course, was because of this very large pre-colonial mound that directly, that the church abuts. This is the back of the church now that we're looking at. Well, let me just go back for 1 minute and show you the, this is the bullfighting ring right here that is wedged in right next to the ruins of the church. And so the barrel vault of this big old mission church has collapsed, and so we're looking at the back wall of the church here. We're looking kind of into the church. So the So we like the idea that there's a pre-colonial component there, and then the church seems to be just situated right on it. And we can all imagine that the stones for this church probably came from the closest place right here. So this is probably a much diminished version of what it looked like when Spaniards came onto the scene, the Spanish friars. Now, as I mentioned, Tahcabo has, the church has lost its barrel vault, and so a new smaller church, almost a chapel, was built on the footprint of the nave of the church. And this is really partially the original front face of the church. And this has happened in a couple of communities of Yucatan. And here you see that bullfighting ring again. So we have this kind of palimpsest or accretional landscape in which we have clearly pre-colonial material, colonial material, and then this 20th century church that's built partly on the footprint of the colonial church. So where are we here? For those of you who know the Yucatan, Merida, Cancun, of course, we all know Cancun. Here's Valladolid here, and Tahcabo here. Aqualam here, Tizimin here. And I'll talk a little bit about Tishwala-Tun down here. So this is a part of Yucatan where the documentary record is not quite as rich as what we have on the west side of the peninsula. Also, any documents, historical documents that were in archives in Valladolid at the time of the 19th century social war or War of the Castes were burned. So we have less of a documentary source. So these churches then, when we look at these old mission churches, they really were the hubs of these 16th century commercial enterprises, and that sequestered the labor of men, women, and children. They're a kind of a materialization of Produktion, forced labor, and lots of political autonomy. So from an analytical standpoint, like kind of a scientific standpoint, they seem like they're kind of ominous things on the landscape, but what we've learned is that that's not at all the way that local communities look at it. And so we have this interesting sort of different perspective, this perspective of the archaeologists and the perspective of local communities. Many of you probably are aware of some of the archival records, because I know a lot of you are doing linguistic work here, but in the Yucatan particularly, the gendered labor of women spinning cotton, weaving cotton was heavily relied upon during the colonial period, heavily called upon. And the weaving, this is Chakchel, patron goddess of weaving, at a backstrap loom using a weaving pick. Here's the cotton plant. The cotton plant itself grew very well in the area of Tahcabo, and so Spaniards, both the friars and the encomenderos, continued to demand cotton, raw cotton, from the people living there. Another thing that Tahcabo was pretty good at was apiarios, bees, keeping bees, making honey, and then the beeswax from honey became very important to Spaniards because it could be used to make candles, and churches, of course, need candles. And so that, for that reason also, Tahcabo became a place that was on the map during the colonial period. The Google Earth map of Tahcabo, believe it or not, there's actually a Google Street map of Tahcabo, which I'll show you in a minute. But see all these green circles? These are radiohadas, and these are kind of like cenotes, only they're dry. They don't hold any water, but they hold very deep, rich soil. And so they're about the only places that you might be able to grow orchard species, fruit trees, cacao in the Yucatan, which is a drier area than the southern lowlands are, the coastal areas. So we can see a surplus of them here. And plus, every town, of course, has to have access to water, and we know the Yucatan is a place with no or very little surface water, and the cenotes, the solution sinkholes that penetrate to the freshwater lands are how people supply themselves with water. So here we have two cenotes right here, and then here's the main plaza with the basketball court, which I'll come back to in a minute. And so here's cenote. The first cenote is big, beautiful cenote. You can walk right down into it. And this is the Van Batun drinking the water, the Zuiha, or virgin water, of the second cenote. So we all watched him drink it to see if he'd get sick afterwards. Of course he didn't get sick. Okay, so let's get back to these churches, though. Let me just go back here a little bit. This is Tishwalatun, so this is just down the road on the south side of Valladolid, another place, another community we've been working with. And this barrel vault of this mission church also has collapsed. And also you see these cracks running down the front of it. The state of Yucatan has rebuilt the barrel vaults for a lot of the mission churches, but this church will not get a new barrel vault because the front wall of the church is about ready to collapse. And so the community is sort of adamant about still using the church, and you can see that they've built a ramada inside here, and services go on in there. The story that the community tells is that the church was built on top of a shrine to Chak, and that these cracks were caused by lightning strikes. And so there's this very kind of interesting story about what is putting the church in peril. But the community is very proud of this church, of the monumentality of it. And these churches are really emblematic of community. And so we have this kind of post-colonial landscape in which these places and objects that might be kind of symptomatic of oppression are actually embraced by the community through time, and the community becomes a sort of a very proud place that is emblematic of community. And here's the church pews under the Ramada. Okay, if we go back to Tahcabo, this is some of the ways and recreational ways in which the church is being used today. The ruins of the old church, and the boys are swinging from lianas that are growing from that big, beautiful arch over the church. So we began to really kind of ask people, how do you feel about these places in your community? What do you use them for? The mound, the pre-colonial mound that exists next to the church is known in town as the best place to get cell phone reception. And when we started talking about, well, ways to conserve the heritage of the town, one community member actually suggested that we build a nice staircase up to the top of the mound, and then a little platform up there with a shade structure over it, so that they could talk on their cell phone up there and not be in the sun. So you can see that the ways in which the landscape is used and valued is in ways very different from how archaeologists see a landscape and think about it. Now, this is the Google Street View in Tahcabo, and this is the basketball court, and it was recently built. Here's the front of the new church. And when the basketball court was built, colonial burials were disturbed. And this really disturbed people in the community to see these skulls and long bones coming out of the backfill. And so the community then were challenged with managing their dead from the from colonial times, and figuring out how to affect civic improvements to their town. There's only maybe 500 people living in this town now, but in the past it appears to have been probably a town of several thousands of people. And how to manage the dead from colonial times, but still implement civic improvements and things that will make their town desirable to young people, because every one of these rural Yucatec towns is trying to figure out a way to stay viable and not, you know, just hemorrhaging population off into Valladolid and Merida. So getting back again to that Google view, we estimate that the size of this colonial cemetery could potentially be based on where people tell us they found things this large. Here's the church over here, here's the ball court over here, and here's the main town plaza, the pre-colonial mound there. So we have, we are working with the community to, we're trying to get some remote sensing down there to try to see if we can pick up the spatial extent of the colonial burials. We also then, this summer, found a noria, which is a well to the north, on the north end, and the remains of a platform. So it looks as though the front of the church is right here, and it looks like the sort of the convento was off to the left if you were looking straight at the church, and then this area to the north of it might have been part of where the friar had either fields or trees or cattle or something like that, and was using the noria to water things. Here's the noria, which seems to be a colonial construction, and an old broken water jug that was sitting near it. So we then said, okay, let's do some surface collection on this platform that's right next to it and see what we can find. And this is a sample of some of the pottery and these bivalves that are used in the Christianization and the baptism process. A lot of those, but the pottery is, you know, just, there's historical material, there's Cape Hench material, there's post-classic material, so there's a little bit of everything. So very challenging to try to find sealed context from early colonial period. Maybe impossible, we don't know, but that's some of my graduate students there doing a surface collection on top of this very stony mound. So this is a community meeting then, so it's community archaeology, so we have community meetings in which we present to the community what we're doing and ask for feedback from the community, find out what the community is concerned about, and we found out about their concerns about the burials, and what, you know, could we do anything about that? Could we help them with that? They really want to have some kind of bilingual Spanish and Yucatec course material for their school about the history of Tahcabo, so that the students can learn something about the place in which they grow up. So there were, you know, a number of things that they were kind of interested in finding out if we were interested in working on these projects with them. And then with these community meetings, of course, you always have to give the kids something to do. And we had already designed a coloring book that was a very simple bilingual coloring book with short phrases in Yucatec and in Spanish. And so we photocopied some of the pages out of that and bought a whole bunch of Crayolas and gave the kids a chance to do some coloring, which they really went at with a vengeance, and they were just really very excited about that. So this is where we're at. We're really in our opening seasons of our work at Tahcabo, and we're getting community feedback on what we're doing. We're trying to find colonial Maya houses. And we'll see, and we're working together with the community to try to determine the extent of the Colonial cemetery that is underneath their basketball court, in front of and between the two churches. So I wanted to pass out now before we go into talking some materials. This is the program that we're running this through is called Inherit. Here, I'll just give those to you and you can pass them around. And so that's just a little card that tells you a little bit about Inherit and what we do. It's a program run out of the University of North Carolina that focuses on cultural heritage education and archaeological projects done in conjunction with communities. So I'll stop on that note and we can get into discussion mode.
Yep. Thank you very much. Well, right. Yeah, we can start the discussion or questions. Yes.
I have a question. You mentioned this construction of this basketball court and that they were distressed by the bones that came out just like this. Didn't the INA come and did some rescue excavation or something, or nothing?
INA is very far away.
Okay.
And no one came from INA to do any to do a rescate.
But still, you have to, well, to get to INA and to talk to INA about your project, you need, I think you need a permit.
Yes, we are permitted. Yes, definitely. And we have received permission to do mapping and surface collection last summer from INA for 2 summers. So we're working on the end of that, and then we'll go back to them for permission to do some excavation. So yeah, definitely we're working through the permitting process with INA.
Yes.
Then continuing the same question, how did they deal with that problem with these bones?
Well, they have little caches of them, here and there that they've shown us, and there, there's a tremendous amount of destruction of cultural heritage that goes on every day in Mexico, and so it really, kind of has to be something kind of fantastic before it really gets on the radar screen of INA. If we started kind of messing around with the ruins of the colonial church structure, probably the INA architects would find their way to us. And there's some big rescates that are going on now because they're building a new road from, from Mérida to Chetumal, I think, or something. Is that work that...
Mérida, Peto.
Yeah. Yeah, so those are, and they kind of systematically, clear the way and excavate a fairly tiny fraction of what is impacted, but they're they're preoccupied with larger projects like that.
Yeah, more, Kai?
Yeah, well, my question was kind of, originally about the same what Nikolai asked now, the approach that you had to the community, to INA, to the officials, let's say, not only INA, but also the town officials, people in the administration, local community leaders, schools, and the like. How did you do that? Can you explain that to Congress? Because I think it's fascinating, but I think it's also difficult.
We're working with the mayor, I guess you call him, of the community, and that's the tricky part about doing this community archaeology, is trying to benefit a fair number of people in the community, and start working through the leadership structure in the community. Are there certain factions of the community that are systematically being left out of what you're doing. So we always, we do the best that we can, but there is always the potential of that, and we're trying to, we have some programs. For instance, if you do a program in the schools, well, all the kids are going to be in the schools probably, so then you're not really just giving preferential treatment to those who know the mayor very well, but I think you always have to be careful with that and kind of keep your eyes open to not working solely with just the sort of the inner circle of people who are close to the mayor or something like that, having to show up at the community meetings. We had about we had about a quarter of the population at the community meetings, so that was good. But then we've since found out that there actually is kind of a faction in the community, that part of the community has Spanish names and live on the north side of town, and then part of the community has kept their Maya names and they live, or have Maya names. I mean, they might be very different populations and live in another part of town. So that presents a new challenge to us that we'll deal with in this season, try to figure out how we can try to work with both groups.
So also in Maya, I guess, I mean, from your side or from the side of the students, presentations are done in Spanish and Maya, or?
The presentations that we give are in Spanish. My co-director Ivan Batun, his Maya is not that good, so he feels a lot. He speaks. He doesn't feel comfortable speaking in Maya, and I certainly couldn't do that. So, but we have. I think we're perfectly capable of getting together information that, like the bilingual coloring book. We did that several years ago, working with, Yucatec linguistic groups, Yucatec language linguistic groups in Yucatan. So, we can get the resources together to get pull things together for the kids in the grade school, at that level.
Yeah, Antje?
Did you experience, as many others of us, I guess, have experienced, if you come to a village and talk to the people about their history, they tell you it's not our history, it's a different epoch and different, that it's not the history of our ancestors? And if so, how did you react? How to break up that?
Yeah, and that's what I was referring to at the beginning when I was talking about how long ago the late classic is, and that's a very long time ago. So if I came in here and I asked how many of you feel that Charlemagne is your ancestor, you'd probably be like, yeah, right, lady. So it's a very long time ago, and in some parts, it's very interesting because where we see the most kind of linking with the past is in the highlands of Guatemala, where the populations, linguistically at least, seem to be the most distant from classic period populations. But in Yucatan, there is, you often hear that, and that's part of the reason why we're focusing on the colonial period rather than the more distant classic period. And even though, we're pretty sure that, the populations have, in a sense of biological descent, are pretty similar to the classic period, there's really a disconnect. And a lot of that, there's 500 years of colonialism, or 300 years of colonialism, and then the Mexican state, and so there's a lot of water under the bridge, and ways in which people have been distanced from the past. And people don't, like in Guatemala, we were just talking about this at lunch, in Guatemala there's a real sacred sites, emphasis, and a kind of an active effort to recognize Maya archaeological sites as sacred sites of the indigenous population. In Yucatan, people are like, INA controls that. It's not really seen as a struggle that people even want to have. They don't want to go there. Yucatec Mayan people. And their sort of revitalization is more focused, as you probably know, on writing novels in Yucatec Mayan and poetry and plays and things like that. So the cultural renaissance is going on in different media, and it's not as place-based. But then again, one could also say that, even though colonialism was a pretty horrible experience for people in the highlands of Guatemala, it didn't quite have the same hacienda experience that Yucatec Maya people did. And that was pretty much a complete, just really getting people off their ancestral lands and severing those things from the past. So very different histories, very different colonial histories, very different histories with the nation state too, in Guatemala and Honduras and Belize and Mexico.
Yeah, Kai?
Sorry. Well, I would say that that's a really interesting point, because I felt that it's very present actually in the Yucatan area, the pre-Hispanic past. On all billboards, you get Chichen Itza at least, and you got Balam, and especially in that area, you got a lot of very famous and present sites. But it seems that the Mexican side is making something wrong in like delivering it to their own people. It's too touristic focused maybe, and that they cannot create really the sense for the local people that these are really sacred spaces in general, and not only the big sites, but also many of the smaller sites maybe, which are rarely visited, like Uruguay, for example, or other sites close by.
And it's not totally that people don't want to, local Yucatec Maya people don't want to maybe have a ceremony in downtown Chichen, but getting permission to do that is very, very difficult. And so, Ivan will complain about how the, kind of New Agers can come down from Mexico City and get permission to do some ridiculous thing, in front of the Castillo. And then if local people say, well, we would like to have, some space to do something, they say, no, we're not going to go there. We're not going to go there. And so there's a very strong sense that this is something that in Mexico that has to be controlled. And you do get that from INA. And there's a very interesting description by Randy McGuire, who did an archaeological project on the far northern borderlands, and it was O'odam, Tohono O'odam in Sonora, and he had just been working on the U.S. side of the border, and they had done some excavation, and then they had, reburied the materials, and so, Randy was sort of oblivious, I guess. So he thought he would do the same thing when they started working on the Mexican side. And, very quickly INA said, no, you're not going to bring that stuff down here. We're not going there. And so, there is, the state is in control, and the state wants to keep it that way. Either the state of Yucatan or the state of Mexico.
Well, I would like to add that there was a time, not too long ago, when archaeological sites did play an important role in Maya oral traditions. And I'm thinking about, for example, the importance of Chichen Itza for the Maya from Quintana Roo, and the idea that was told to Morley. We talked about it. Morley, that there was a Kushan Thum, the living rope buried in the Baucourt of Chichen, and it would come back with the arrival of a new Messiah. And Tulum is part of the has been part of the pilgrimage program for the Maya living along the coast. When Gann and Morley came, they met Maya who lived in Tulum and were using the Castillo still, and depositing offerings. The same happened at Cobar. So I think there was a tradition of incorporating this into local identity for some time, probably until the state became stronger and INA took over control of sites.
Yeah, probably maybe the 1940s that
Probably.
started happening when
Yes.
when the state of Mexico started to, the nation state started to put money into restoring sites for tourism.
Exactly.
And Alberto Ruz found the burial of Pakal under Palenque, under the temple, the inscriptions at Palenque, and all that. Then I think there was a formalization of boundaries
Yes.
and what could happen inside those spaces. Because I know still in spaces that are not, they're archaeological, but they're not tourist havens, like where Joel Palka works in the Lacandon area. There's very much there are people really still very much linked to sites of the past, and they see them as part of their heritage. So that's really significant. I think that's a significant turning point in the post-World War II era. Yeah.
Which was the era also of indigenism, of Mexican indigenism.
Indigenismo.
When Mexicans discovered their own past, and all of a sudden all Mexicans became the raza, and this I think this Mexican raza ideology was developed.
Same time. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, and very intricate, very complicated. A lot of factors at work where nationalism is being built, and there's this sense of indigenismo, but it's being kind of orchestrated from the top in a very homogeneous kind of way. So it's, but Mexico, probably of all the countries within the Maya region, Mexico really is the only country that attempted to forge some sort of national identity that was this hybrid identity,
right.
at least on paper and officially. They did that.
But that's an interesting point, if I might add something, because especially in the small villages, what is very strong is the school education with the national history displayed, with specific thematic focus. For example, the Aztec realm as a major part of national Mexican identity, which is very distant from the school children's present, and even from the family's history or from the history of the local village. But by school education, they managed to create a specific picture of history in the heads of the people.
Yes, it's really true. So there's been this sort of selective elevation of Aztec history and forging of nationalism around the supposed hybridity of that, and Spanish Castellanos, and then no one else is mentioned. And it's like, don't you know how Maya people feel about the Aztecs? Not very good. So it's really, even how that played out didn't necessarily do much for a sense of self-worth or pride and identity.
Question or comments?
Is there any resistance to your project in Tahcabo, or the community members will be accepting it?
Yeah, not that we've run into yet. We did have a couple of two gentlemen who were very drunk one day who were saying all sorts of stuff to us, but I I think that was just a momentary condition they were in or something. But so I don't know, there hasn't been a lot of resistance. I think that it's, a lot of these smaller communities, rural communities, I think they really feel like they're struggling and they're trying to hold on to their population and they're trying to figure out a way that they can survive and keep young people from leaving. And so anything that might start up something new and fresh, there's generally people are pretty receptive to it.
So they do see it then as something that can help them, I guess, recuperate as a community. I guess then imagine you could also see it as a distraction from what they really need to be doing in terms of improving the economic lives and standards of living there.
Well, I guess that a lot of communities often will they'll ask for something that will result in just crazy tourism. You know, they think that's like the way to have like hordes of, you know, people coming in buses to their town, when that's probably really the last thing that they really would want to have to deal with. But and it's also, you know, we're always walking the tightrope to be honest about what we can do and why and how people would come to this town. At the same time, you know, this is just an amazing historical resource that people are living amidst, and just without a lot of access to information about it. And so just even bringing that piece back into like the school curriculum is so that kids can get a sense of really the history of their town. That would be, I think, very helpful. And it, you know, it's, you know, economic well-being is really tied to a sense of pride in who you are, a sense of a feeling of well-being about who you are. Those things are all interrelated. And if the place you grow up in is sort of new value, certainly somehow comes to it, you know, that can really have a real impact on how a child develops and thinks about themselves and where they can go and what their life opportunities might be. So I think we have to think about it in a larger sense than just, you know, will this create jobs?
Yeah. What do you think is the role of intellectuals, or are there Maya intellectuals, Yucatec intellectuals? Are they rooted in the community? I have my impression from contact with Maya organizations such as Maya On in Valladolid is that it was just a top group of bilingual teachers, and they had very advanced ideas about recreating Maya culture and reinventing Maya literature. But at the same time, their communication was very closed, and it was a small group, and there was no outreach really. The community was not integrated, which is a little bit different in Guatemala, where these intellectuals have a larger home base, and so even though the Maya movement in Guatemala still is an intellectual movement of a certain group of people, but I think it has already a larger, they have managed to stimulate nationwide interest at least. It's a big topic in Guatemala. And as you already mentioned, it's not the case in Yucatan, obviously. And
well, I think that there is, I'm thinking of, what's her name? I can't remember. She lives in Tizimin. And Tizimin is not exactly a small town, but you know, she's a local community activist. And so I think that there certainly are and there's this movement, but you really see a lot of activity in the slightly larger towns like Valladolid, Oshkutska, Merida, so it does tend to be in these the small cities or the large towns where you kind of see this intellectual activity, and then they probably aren't quite as adept as they are in Guatemala at sort of maintaining those roots to the countryside and getting word kind of back to the countryside, bringing programs to the countryside. Yeah, so it's I think in Guatemala, I think the activism is also very, it's really tied up in what happened in Guatemala in the 80s. And so then, you have a different context in Yucatan where people are coming out of the previous century of debt peonage on haciendas, especially in the western part of the state. And so they're very concerned about the sort of the milpa ethic and as sort of as a central organizing idea of their existence, and that's pretty rural. But you hear that metaphor a lot in Yucatan about the milpa as a central sort of organizing force of life. So it is a different context.
I would like to add something again. I agree that actors or players on the cultural ground like my own or Tushanon are very elite people because they are like cultural entrepreneurs communicating and between the worlds of the still whites, of the mestizo society and the local society. And but nevertheless they are triggering a little bit, and from my point of perspective I see that you do have different movements going in a parallel way. And even Kai mentioned that tourism, or somebody else, tourism also has a quite, in between all the negative effects, it has quite a positive effect, because people get to know that history and their own local history gets important, and that there are government programs from the federal governments in Yucatan and in Quintana Roo, and then triggering down also to the municipality political programs, that they have to rediscover their own history to make something out of it. If you look, for example, the things that are going on in the department of Jose Maria Morelos, which is far away from tourism, but they are trying to push ahead their colonial history with their colonial churches, with the colonial settlements. And so I think it's not in the same way strong as it is known from Guatemala, but there is something going on, and it will have an outcome in several years, but it might not be the way we as researchers would like it, because I can see that a lot of young people are really fond of history, and they are recreating colonial or pre-colonial dances, which is very famous at the moment, and they are doing it in schools, and they are doing it as youngsters or as teenagers when they are 20, 21. And this is not what we would say, this is really pre-colonial, because the costume is totally fantastic and has more to do with films on Egyptian history, and the music is not what we would say, well, this is rooted on a really grounded research how music was, and even the dance, the choreography is some kind of fantasy. And also what Mayon is doing is creating new biographies for the historical personalities. So there is a lot of going on, but it's more like reinvention of traditions. I think it's for
It's
us
cultural
as-
expression, you
Yeah,
know, it's
as-
cultural expression and it's not some sort of pure thing from the past, and it doesn't have to be that, and it shouldn't be that.
But the question for me is how are we going to deal with it?
As archaeologists and scholars, no?
Yes.
Do we live with the fact that what we produce really has no impact or very little impact on their knowledge?
Well, I think the role of sort of education and cultural expression, that, you know, I don't feel that people, just because they're ethnically Mayan, should, if they're going to make up a dance, that it should look some special way. I mean, I think they should be as free to make up a dance as you or I would be. So, you know, I think there's like far too much stereotyping of what these, what this cultural expression should look like. But you're right when you say that, you know, things are happening and it may not look the way that we think it would turn out, but it, you know, I think what's important is cultural expression, and as a way to mobilize sort of a sense of action and affirmation and opportunity. So to me, those are the most important things. I do see that in places in Quintana Roo, like Tahcabo, which has a beautiful Castwar museum now that is totally locally run. And it's, they've worked a lot with Richard Leventhal from Penn, and he's mapping some of the Castwar sites. And so, and that's another period of time that I find in the minds of Yucatec Mayan people, that's a real threshold event, and that's a real source of pride for most Yucatec Mayan people, especially in Quintana Roo. And so so there's a lot going on there too, and that sort of begins to look a little bit more like what's happening in the highlands. But that's another, you know, pretty strong movement right now in that part of my world.
Yeah, I've been working on the Tahcabo Museum as well, and it's nice for me to see that they are rewriting history, because they are sending out, they have a lot of, comparably a lot of money, so they are sending out small booklets and write a different history
From
in
the
some
Maya
villages.
perspective.
Yeah.
That needs to happen.
Yeah, well, I would say that yes, in the highlands you have this very local, localized identity, community-based or Pueblo-based, and I think that's what you had originally also in the Mayan lowlands in general, very localized identity formation. And I wonder if there's like this difference between this pan-Mayanism, which is created not by the local community itself, but put onto it from the media or from the government or from wherever, while deep inside they really need and look for their local identity much more. That way, I think it's really good that you have this focus very much on the local history and trying to dig out and retrace the history of one community and not so much extending it to the whole area.
Yeah, and I think that as we get more involved with communities, we really reinvent the specific, or we go back to a very, very historical kind of archaeology almost, because that's really what communities are interested in. And so they don't really care about our highfalutin theories about things. They really do kind of want to know what was going on in this place, 500 years ago in a very specific way. And the variation of experience across what we call the Maya region. I'm really writing a lot about this now, so I'm really grappling with this, that, as archaeologists, we have this artificial construct we call the Maya region, but it has some linguistic component to it, and in terms of a Mayan language family. And then if you look in the classic period, you can see, well, it was some kind of area across which there were all these interactive nodes, and so it wasn't like people were completely separate from each other, didn't know about each other, but yet, you know, you do have the sense that if you really were going to be honest about it, that these identities were very local, and that we need to keep that in mind. And so a lot of the Pan-Mayanism that we heard a lot about in the 90s in Highland Guatemala, I mean, I think that was really a strategy of survival. And, you know, that if we all recognize our commonality, that we can be a more effective force for change within this nation state that we find ourselves, than if we continue to just, you know, say, oh, you know, I'm in my community and I don't have an identity beyond that. So there was, I think, definitely strategic essentialism at work there. Although, you know, Mayan people hate that term. It's like nothing strategic or essential about it, you know. So, but so I think that, you know, and I absolutely hate the term the ancient Maya, because I feel like it's really just referring to the royalty in the end, and that it really just denies just the variety of experiences and identities that must have existed across the lowlands. Plus, we know that there was considerable linguistic diversity when you get below the court language. So it's, yeah, I think that, you know, that's something that we have to always balance, the local and then these larger global categories that we come up with, because they're analytically useful. And there's nothing wrong with that, it's just that we need to keep that in mind.
I think there is also a similar movement going on in Guatemala right now, you know, that local histories are rediscovered, and the focus is taken away from the classic period. You know, and over the last 20 years or 30 years, after the 90s, the Maya themselves defined themselves very much in terms of the inheritance of classic period culture. And Linda's and my workshops also contributed to this notion a little bit. But we see that there is a very strong interest now in discovering the archaeology of a particular town in the Cuchumatanes region, and there are Maya archaeologists such as Yashel Corti, who's now in Vanderbilt, and her interest is Quiche archaeology. They want to combine local history with local archaeology and study of colonial sources, and so, but to control this archaeology. So they are doing something very similar to what you are doing in the Yucatan right now. I think it's a growing movement.
And I think it's a healthy movement. It's really fabulous. It's exactly, you know, what I think needs to happen, that it be kind of deconstructed, and then we can put it all back together again, but on different terms.
Well, if there are no other questions, let me continue with one more question concerning your actual archaeological project. Do you intend to excavate colonial households, and what do you expect to find, and what is your interest, particularly in regard, let's say, to economic processes and gender?
We're hoping to be able to, we'll probably go next into a testing phase to try to find houses and find middens, and what we would like to do is excavate a series of houses and associated middens to look at the variety from house to house of production activities, to see whether every house has tons of spindle whorls in the associated middens or not. There's also quite a bit of discussion in some of the ethnohistorical sources about there being specific, and Quesada mentions this in one of the articles that you looked at, about there being a house where women were weaving. And whether this has pre-colonial antecedents or not, I don't know. But it kind of smacks of a sort of Foucaultian kind of ultimate control of the women, put them all in the women's weaving house so that they produce their requisite number of mantas. So that we would love to find a future like that, that had a lot of spindle whorls and weaving picks, maybe perhaps scattered around it. So we're really, at this point in time, trying to establish an independent base of evidence that we can play off of the archival records to evaluate, to bring another kind of evidence to it. And then in doing so, we really have, we have something, we have a record that materially was produced by Maya people rather than records that, Spaniards wrote down. So, that will be interesting to be able to compare those two. I think that we also, preservation is always going to be an issue, but any sort of indices that we could arrive at that would evaluate wealth and diet and nutrition, and then the whether there's variation from house to house, or whether all the houses pretty much look the same, in terms of having the same assemblage and access to the same kinds of resources. So we'd like, and I think that we'll probably find, if we're lucky, a Maya cacique house, such as has been excavated at Lamanai. So that would give us then another point of reference. And we might end up going in and excavating some of the, sort of, if we can find midden areas around the convento where the friar lived, to also have that as a comparison. We might take a look at that if we can get permission to do that from INA. So that's, that's our, it's not a really solid research design right now. We have one more summer of mapping this summer, and then at that point in time, we'll try to really put together a pretty solid research design that we'll use to request funding. Stay tuned. And check out the website, the Inherit website, and we have a Facebook page too. You can friend us, you can sign up to receive our quarterly newsletter on the website, and all that stuff. So let us become one of our members or friends. We'd love that.